Right. Are we all ready? Sorry to stop the music. I mean, I quite like that, actually. We should always have music on in the office. Fantastic. So thank you so much all for coming on. I mean, this is really awesome participation. I'm really stoked. Welcome, everyone. I'll just open with a whakatauki and then we get going here today. Thank you. The whakatauki that I chose today goes like this. He kai ki aku ringa. There's food at the end of my hands. And the reason why I chose this whakatauki is because it signifies resilience, empowerment, and hope. And I think it's quite appropriate when talking about a budget that delivers for working people. So thank you all for coming on and spending some time with us today. We have developed a mini-series of webinars for the upcoming budget, which will be delivered on the 19th of May, so next week, 1 week out from the budget we are today. And those webinars will deal with a number of different topics. As you have heard today, we are dealing with the question about a budget or how a budget looks like that delivers for working people. Tomorrow we are talking about equality and climate change. And we also have a specific climate change related webinar coming up next week. And then we'll talk again after the budget was delivered on Thursday and discuss what actually happened and where the investment has taken place and if it meets the well-being objectives of the government. So great to have you here. Join us for the other webinars as well. I would love to have you on board for those as well. So today, as you can see here, we are talking with Craig Renney, who is the economist at the CTU, as well as Bernard Hickey, who is a commentator and journalist, and I can warmly recommend the Kaka, his newsletter, which is super interesting commenting. If you're interested, join. And yeah, I think we'll probably get started straight up. But before we get started and I hand over to our guests, just a quick reminder on how we run the webinars. So we will have Craig and Bernard give a bit of an introductory statement at the beginning. Bernard will start us off and then Craig, each for 10 minutes. And then we will get into a bit of a conversation. I have a few questions that I would like to ask, but you are absolutely welcome to please use the question and answer function for your questions. And as always, I will bring them into the conversation. So please keep your questions short and succinct and use the question and answer function down there at the bottom. That would help. Just use the chat for commenting if possible, and your questions in the question answer function. That makes it a bit easier for us to pick up on all your questions. So yeah, I think let's get started. If you're ready, Bernard and Craig, I'll hand over to you, Bernard. 10 minutes, give us a bit of an idea of your thinking about the budget, and then we'll go over to Craig, and yeah, we'll take it from there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Tēnā koutou katoa. Really appreciate the chance to talk to everyone today. And before I give an overview of what I think might be in the budget and the context around it to try and understand what's going on and what's going to happen and what's not going to happen, I wanted to just say to everyone who works for a union or an advocacy group that you are all able to join as full members of the Kaka for free. So a few weeks ago, I opened up membership for the Kaka to everyone who is a student or a teacher or works for an advocacy group or a registered political party. And I did that because I'm focused on doing public interest journalism and having a group of subscribers pay me money every month to do that. And one of the things I'm keen to do is to make sure that the journalism I do is spread around as widely as possible. And one way to ensure that is that those people who maybe do it as part of their advocacy work or would really love to have it, but aren't perhaps in the financial position to afford it, can have it. So anyone with an email address that's ctu.org.nz or psa.org.nz or any other union or advocacy group can have full access to the kaka. Right, so the budget next Thursday is in many ways already set in stone, and we know an awful lot about what's going to be in it and what isn't. And I suspect next Monday's big announcements on the emissions reduction plan will in many ways be a bigger deal than what actually comes out in the budget on Thursday. So let's set the scene here for what the government is able to do and what parameters it can work within, both political and economic, and give you an idea of what we're going to see. So the big picture here, obviously, is that the government is coming out of close to $70 billion worth of extra spending over a couple of years on the pandemic, in response to the pandemic. In many ways, a big chunk of that money went to businesses in the form of wage subsidies and resurgence payments through 2020 and 2021. Obviously, there was a lot of extra spending on health and responding to the pandemic in various ways. And for a relatively short period, there was some extra spending on welfare payments and various other, what you call automatic stabilizers for the government and for the economy. So the budget went into a significant deficit through 2020 and 2021. And you might have heard a lot of noise from the opposition about how the government's been spraying money around willy-nilly and that the government is addicted to spending and that an enormous debt pile has been built up, which our kids will have to pay for. To give you an idea, yesterday, Max Key turned up at a Business New Zealand function to ask a question of the Prime Minister, who was on Zoom from Wellington, asking her the question, what does she have to say to the future generations about the intergenerational unfairness of all the borrowing that she'd done. You probably sense from the tone of how I've described that I don't agree with that. And I also don't agree that the government has spent up large or recklessly and is addicted to spending. If anything, it's the other way around. It can't quite get addicted to the sort of spending it needs to do. To give you an idea of how wrong those people are who say that the government is addicted to spending and then we have an unsustainable debt pile that will burden future generations. Currently, the New Zealand government's net debt on the most easily comparable measure is around about half that of Australia, less than a third of Britain, and about a fifth of what you see in the United States. And all of those have similar credit ratings to us. You might have heard also that Grant Robertson, the finance minister, announced last week that there is a new debt limit for the government. And for those who work in the public sector, you know how important this debt limit is. Effectively, it is the guiding light for everything the government does. It limits, in a very real way, the ambitions of any government to use their balance sheet, i.e. be able to borrow to deal with our long-term problems and sometimes even our short-term problems. And it's been there for 30 years as I call it an internal steering mechanism designed to keep the size of government small and to, wherever possible, offload the costs of new infrastructure onto the people who are buying new houses, and to be as user pays as possible. The end result of that has been that we've underinvested in infrastructure in a structural, fundamental, huge way, and we now have an infrastructure deficit of over $100 billion as measured last week by the Infrastructure Commission, and we probably need to spend another $100 billion on top of that, simply to keep up with the need to improve our water quality, deal with climate change, and deal with population growth that will no doubt happen over the next 20 or 30 years. So given that context, that the government is coming out of a period of running quite large deficits to deal with COVID, and is getting accused by the opposition of being reckless and pumping up inflation and being addicted to spending, the government is in a mood to say to the public, and remember, it's doing this from a position of now being behind in the polls, behind National in the polls, saying to the public that it is a responsible manager of the budget, and that the government is, quote, striking a balance between supporting public spending during a crisis and investing in infrastructure for the future, but at the same time keeping a lid on debt is the phrase you'll hear a lot, keeping a lid on debt, to ensure that interest rates stay relatively low, and the implication is that the government will not add to much of the inflationary pressure in the economy. The key thing to know from an economic and I think a political sense right now is that the inflation rate, which in the March quarter was 6.9%, which is obviously well above the 1 to 3% band which inflation's been in for most of the last 30 years, and which the Reserve Bank is supposed to target. That is now a political issue as well as an economic one, in that the opposition have been running a campaign of a so-called cost of living crisis, and is obviously campaigning for tax cuts, most of which would be delivered to people earning more than $80,000. This, in theory, is designed to help the, quote, squeezed middle. It's never been defined by National what the squeezed middle is, and actually the numbers referred to by Christopher Luxon of anyone earning more than $50,000 or $60,000 it seems ignorant of the fact that a lot of families earning that much money are getting significant amounts of help from the government in the form of accommodation supplements and working for families payments. But his rhetoric that this helps the squeezed middle is wrong, and I think the squeezed middle is actually doing quite well at the moment. The other context to what we're going to see in the budget is, of course, that unemployment at 3.2% is very low. And some people in the business community and a few economists think that the employment market is now full up, so to speak. It is running too hot, and that it's generating inflation through wage inflation. I don't think that's necessarily the case. When you look at the actual inflation, the wage inflation numbers, which, to be fair, tend to lag what's happening in the real economy. The labour cost index measure of inflation is barely 3%. In fact, it's slightly lower in the public sector right now. And when you look at the average weekly earnings measure, that's rising at about 5%. That doesn't take into account people's promotions or some of the sort of quality changes that you get with job performance. And 3% is hardly a wage price spiral like the 1970s. So, but the overall narrative, which is dominating the politics and the economics at the moment, is that we have an inflation problem, we have a risk of a wage problem, we have the government spending a lot of money and in theory pushing up inflation. And so the government is having to respond to that simply because it's behind in the polls at the moment. So Just to finish up my 10 minutes, the guts of the issue is that the government has announced in December that it was going to have a $6 billion operating allowance. So that's new spending in this year, but that a good chunk of that will be used to support the health sector through the reforms away from DHBs to the new health authority and the Māori Health Authority. And also there is a chunk of money, about $4.5 billion over 4 years, that will be spent, essentially the emissions trading scheme money that is going to be repurposed or respent on climate change measures. Now, we don't know what they are, but there's been some speculation that it could include extending the discount, the half price public transport, potentially extending the discount on fuel taxes, potentially moving to congestion charging in Auckland, possibly in exchange for dropping the Auckland fuel levy. And the other piece of news that we already know from the budget is that the government is not going to increase its capital spending allowance for the next 4 years, even though we clearly have an infrastructure deficit. The government's got just over 50 billion or so of capital spending locked in, but that doesn't go anywhere near filling the hole of the $100 billion of a deficit we have, let alone dealing with climate change and what's coming up ahead. So in my view, the government should be using its balance sheet, because it probably has a good 10 to 15 percentage points of room in its balance sheet. When I say 10 to 15 percentage points, that's of GDP. So that, is a good 30 or $40 billion extra that the government could or should be spending. In fact, I actually think that the self-imposed 30% net debt target by the government is significantly too low. And again,
I think that's a good final word, Bernard.
good sign of, sorry?
There was a good final word, I think. I would like to hand over
Go
to Craig, if that's all right.
Sure. Yep.
Awesome. Thank you. There was so much information, very rich indeed. Thank you so much. And I'm sure you can contribute more to the questions when we get to that. But first, Craig, your 10 minutes, please.
Thank you. But before I start, can I just stand with Bernard on his position on the government debt and the rules they've just set themselves, and certainly what we've heard from some quarters around, the debt pile that exists and the growth in debt that we had during COVID. It's one, it's not true, and two, it's actually worse than that. It's dangerous. It's disinformation. We have a giant opportunity to invest in New Zealand. We have lots of things we can invest in. As you heard, the $104 billion infrastructure gap before we get there. There is no public debt crisis in New Zealand. What there is a public infrastructure crisis in New Zealand. And one of the things we need to get our head around is actually we're in a much stronger position than many commentators or many politicians would want to have you believe. We actually have plenty of options or choices how we deliver those options, not the restrictions that we think, or removing spending that we think should be taking place right now. We're in a position that many other countries would give their eye teeth to have, and we shouldn't be afraid of where we are. Can I just first say, and before we start, I love budgets. It's like Christmas, only better. But this budget is more important than many budgets for many years. I know every budget is important, but this one's really important for many reasons. And one of which, as Bernard mentioned, we have a $6 billion operating allowance, and that's a piece of jargon. What does it mean? It means the Crown has set aside the largest amounts of money for many years in terms of increasing spending, and that's raised expectations in many quarters of what's actually going to get spent and how it's going to get spent. There's pressure on the cost of living, and there's expectations that the government will provide some succor to that, will provide some means to address that cost of living. And election 23 is just around the corner. And what happens at this budget is what will be real at the election. Budget 23, which happens next year, whatever happens there will happen after the budget really takes place. So this budget is the one that you will be seeing and feeling at the election time. That's what makes it so important. And one of the things I saw in the chat, in the lead up to this, was The music, as we were joining this show, was very 1970s flavoured. And are we likely to see a return to the 1970s in this budget? I certainly don't think so, and I certainly hope not in this budget. But if we sort of cut through sort of the noise and people demanding things and other things, what are budgets for? Why are budgets important? They're important because they provide the government with an opportunity to set out a plan. And it's a plan to address housing, to address infrastructure, to address public services and how we put them on a sustainable footing after COVID, how we address climate change and the inevitability of change that's going to do there, how we address inequality, how we address child poverty. The Prime Minister's number one reason she got into office was to address child poverty. How do we make sure we're continuing to do that as a consequence of all of these? And above all, it's a particular means by which we can say how can we say we're going to spend some money, but how are we going to deliver that money, and what difference is it going to make to the issues that New Zealanders really care about? So what is to be done? Well, to my mind, the government has to do three things at once. It must actually deliver on its well-being agenda. Every year now, the government produces a budget which has a thing called the well-being analysis at the front of it, which is lots of numbers that tells us everything that's wrong in New Zealand. The water's polluted, the air's polluted, we have child poverty. And as a consequence, we have lots of understanding of what's going wrong, but we don't then link it to the spending. And so we really need to be drawing much closer lessons between that analysis of what's wrong and how the spending in the government that the government's going to deliver is really going to deliver on that problem. It must demonstrate that there's a direct link between spending and delivery. Otherwise, the government's going to lose the social license to continue to keep spending money and to keep investing. It must also demonstrate that it can be delivered. One of the many narratives that's got some traction right now is that the government can spend money, but it can't then do anything with that money. We've had lots of stories about the $1.9 billion for mental health not delivering. And those are the things that we need to see lots more movement on, that we can not only deliver spending, but we can then deliver on the delivery part of that. And two, it must show a plan for the economy, not just now, but also in the future, and how we grow out of COVID and how the economy is going to be different growing out of COVID. The recession fears that some people want to talk about are a bit overdone right now. I think, economists have a particularly poor track record. We've forecasted the last 13 of the last 4 recessions in the real world, but we are going to be hitting a period of time where there's going to be a lot more economic turbulence. And so what's our plan for growing through that? What's our plan for becoming more resilient? What's our plan for retaining jobs and income security during that period of time? And the budget provides a real opportunity to do that. How do we maintain growth in the future? How do we maintain growth when we have more climate change consequences? How do we build what the Minister of Finance often calls that just transition? That idea that you can keep your job, you can have security of income, because we will help you move from one job to another. And as sectors grow or change, individuals will move into them in ways that enhance the overall economy and enhance individuals and families' economic security. And then finally, how does the government manage, essentially the conflict inherent in its own policy portfolio? We've got a cost of living crisis, allegedly 7% inflation, 3% income growth, but for 38% of New Zealanders last year, they didn't get a pay rise at all. And for 78% of New Zealanders, they got a pay rise well below that of inflation. So how do we manage the cost of living with the need to deliver fiscal responsibility? Because the story in the press, as Bernard quite rightly talked about, is every time the government makes an investment, often an essential investment, often something that needs to be done, it's accused of profligacy. It's approved of just throwing money out there and not really tackling the issues that New Zealanders care about, or actually, I'd argue, health, education, housing, climate change. Those are the issues New Zealanders care about, rather than a tax cut, or rather than certainly returning tax advantages to landlords, which is what some of us would want to do. How do we deliver a better housing market solution without crashing the housing market? building materials are growing, costs are growing at 18% a year. How do we build more houses and not just simply exacerbate that? How do we deliver the workforce that we need to deliver in building, and to make sure we have the skills necessary in the construction sector so we can continue to grow right through the next few years? How do we do that in a world of increasing interest rates, not only in New Zealand, but around the world, which will drive everyone's mortgages? And then finally, how do we free up land and remove some of the restrictions that we see, especially in urban areas, that are stopping urban density, that are stopping the building of essential housing, and are stopping New Zealanders from being able to get clean, modern, dry, warm housing that New Zealanders need and deserve? How do we stop the conflict between the poverty agenda and welfare reform agenda and the opposition's demand for tax cuts and the seeming public popularity of the demand for tax cuts? So how do we make sure that when we have economic growth, which we have right now, economic growth was 5.5% last time it was measured, that growth goes to everyone, that it reaches new people that it hasn't met in the past, that people don't fall further behind, which, to be frank, we have done over the past 30 years. How do we make sure that we're addressing the cost of living for everyone? Now, for higher costs of living for lower income groups have been an issue for the past 10 years. Many people now just seem to care about them because cost of living is now reaching higher income groups, and it's actually starting to affect them. The inflation for the lowest 20% of income earners in New Zealand has run 40% higher than the top income earners over the past 10 years. But only now it's an issue because that's driving that particular change. And then so how do we deliver on the conflict between the aspirations that the government talks about often in policy and its ability to deliver? Bernard talked about, and we talk about transport. So public transport, how do we deliver better subsidized public transport, more frequent public transport, and actually remove our continued reliance upon imported fossil fuels to deliver our transport fleet? How do we deliver our goals on climate change, our aspirations on climate change, and do so in ways that don't don't bury the costs of that onto the very lowest income groups, which is what currently many of the policies like the fuel taxes do, because those with the lowest incomes, they pay more of that as a percentage of their income, and so they have to bear more of the costs for them. So overall, they've got to manage these three inherent conflicts. How do they do it? And for the public sector, what does that mean? So for me, the public sector challenge can be broken down essentially into, again, three parts. If we look across the government and the funded sector, funding's needed to maintain the recovery from COVID in New Zealand. Many frontline workers, and many PSA workers will know this, responded magnificently to COVID, responded flexibly, went above and beyond, and besides receiving, a medal or a badge from the government, what's the best tangible response we can do that is to build long-term sustainable public services that deliver for New Zealand and deliver for public sector workers. And we need to see that put on the table as part of this budget. We need to see pay rising again. We need to see the move away from, public sector pay freeze. Public sector pay freeze makes absolutely no sense when you have inflation at 7%. We need to see, care and support workers and other workers who have pay equity issues, given solutions at this particular budget, have their grievances heard. We also need to make sure that we're not going backwards on pay equity deals as we might, do in the care and support work sector. So there's lots of things the government could be doing across government and across the funded sector. But I just want to concentrate on two areas that I think are really important. In health inflation runs at roughly double whatever the standard inflation is. So if CPI is 7% in health, it'll be roughly 10 to 14%. And so we need to be making lots more investments just to stand still in health. And one of the things COVID did was it highlighted how many of the gaps there were in public health. And so we need to be, our reform of DHBs, managing demand, managing, rising costs, we need to do that, but we need to do that in ways that, give security to the allied workforce, to give security to NZNO, we need to be doing that in ways that provide them with that security of funding. And it's similarly in education. We've seen a blizzard of changes in education. How do we manage, those blizzard of changes in education? And ACE teachers, it's a bit like being a bit pregnant. You can't have a bit of a pay equity settlement. You either have pay equity or you don't. And so the government needs to come to the table with the rest of the pay equity deal. So if I can just finish with one thing at the end of this, we need to be very careful in demanding all of, in all of our demands, in all of our thoughts. The opposite of what is on the table is not necessarily what we want. The opposite of what's on the table right now is the National Party, is tax cuts, is services cuts, is reductions to essential services for some of the most vulnerable New Zealanders. Now, that doesn't make any of our lives any better. And in fact, it makes them in many cases worse. So yes, we need to campaign for many of the things that we want to see in this budget, but we should also remind ourselves that the opposite is worse. And we need to make sure that at budget 22 and at budget 23, we're building the case and making the case with as many New Zealanders as we can as possible that these essential investments are necessary, desirable, have to happen, and will benefit all New Zealanders, and that they will do so in ways that far outweigh any of the marginal costs that marginal benefits they would get from a tax cut. I'll stop there and happy to take any questions anyone has.
Thank you very much, Craig. I mean, yeah, again, like so many valuable ideas and identification of areas where we desperately need investment, including public services, climate change, in order to not pass on the burden to future generations and deal with the issues at hand. So thank you so much for that. I noticed that we have a really lively chat, which is really awesome. Thank you everyone for contributing. And we also have a number of questions, and there are two that stood out for me in particular. One is quoting Keynes, John Maynard Keynes, the famous economist, and he apparently said that anything we can actually do, we can afford. So our participant here is asking, what are actually the barriers of what we can actually do, and how will the budget address that? I mean, why do they not invest more, I suppose, is the big question. And I'll come to the other ones later. Maybe a quick statement from both of you. I think you might both have something to say to that question.
Oops,
sorry. Who wants to start? Bernard, please.
Yeah. I'll keep it brief because I'm a big fan of Keynes. He's right that if we can do it physically, then we should do it, and there's nothing physically to stop us from doing it. And particularly when there are still a couple of 200 or 300,000 people, depending on how you measure it, who say that they would like to do more work. Now, one of the concerns people have about governments spending money to do more on investment is that somehow you push up inflation. Well, everyone in the world is dealing with inflation at the moment. A big chunk of it's come through from energy and food prices, but also, frankly, a big surge in asset prices, which was caused by, in my view, central banks trying to deal with the problem they saw of inflation being too low by pumping too much cash into the global financial system. Although our Reserve Bank, I think, was just as guilty of doing that as anyone else. The real restraints to the government simply solving these problems is political. So the government could agree with the Welfare Expert Advisory Group and simply increase cash incomes for those people who really need it. And it could, over a longer period, plan to build hundreds of thousands of houses and invest in the climate infrastructure we need, Obviously not this year or next year, because yes, you would create an inflation problem if you threw $100 billion at the problem right now. But if you did it over 30 years or so, we certainly would be able to raise the money from bond markets to do it, and retrain workforces and plan to do it. The problem, of course, is that to do it properly, you'd have to have effectively a slightly higher tax rate. And in particular, you'd need to address the issue of income and wealth inequality. And to do that, you need to tax wealth, and in my view, tax land. And that is a central political debate between, let's be frank, the classes in New Zealand. And when I say classes, I mean the landowning and home owning classes versus the renting classes.
Right, thank you, Bernard. Craig.
I mean, there's not much to disagree with there. I mean, I'd argue sort of Keynes, I think, would accept that there are real and imaginary barriers to spending money or to investing or to doing something. And there are real opportunity costs when you decide to do a thing. So if you decide to spend it on one thing, you can't spend it on something else. So, we do need to go carefully through government spending. But the key thing is as Bernard rightly pointed out, is to have a plan, is to actually say, right, we accept there's a problem in housing. How are we going to fix it? We accept there's a problem with child poverty. How are we going to fix it? We accept there's a problem with income inequality, or with the lack of poor quality public services in our place, or with something. How are we going to fix it? It's to have a plan, and in selling that plan to the public and giving the public that information, engaging them, getting them aboard, and getting them to see how essential the investment is. And it very rapidly moves from the you can't do this to everybody accepting that this was essential when everyone's on board. And we've shown that the families package in 2017 showed that nobody now would take away the winter energy payment. When we introduced it, it was seen as, oh, that's a nice to have. Let's not do that. Let's spend the money somewhere else. Now it's an essential part of the welfare state. Best start. Some of the poorest children under the age of 3, giving them a boost during the first 1,000 days, the most important days of their lives. Who in their right mind would take that away? But we had a plan. There needs to be a plan now to deliver on housing, on health, on education, on a range of areas, so that we can take the public with us and they can see the benefits that they're going to get from that investment. And that, again, this is an opportunity for the budget to do exactly that.
Yeah, thank you, Craig. I think that leads nicely into the next question that I wanted to put to both of you. It's about the public having a say in the budget. The budget might look quite differently if the public had a say in it. And the question here from one of our participants is actually, does the public have a say in it? Or, and I would like to extend it a little bit to should it have a say? I think there are countries which practice a participatory budgeting approach, especially on the local level. So I'm quite keen to hear your thoughts on that.
I'll happily start with this one. I'm like you, Andrea. I'm an enormous fan of participatory budgeting, particularly at the neighbourhood level, at the community level, where you're able to say, here is a budget. How do we divide it up? How do we make it make sense? And how do we deliver, the assets and the services that we need at that local level? The challenges we have is that when we have much larger investments that cover much larger areas, you can't trade off between Wellington and the Wairarapa. You need a central government then to do that. And arguably that's why we have an election, is to have the participation and public participation and the ability to make decisions about budgets. But yeah, we certainly should do. One of the things I would say is that if the public had more of a say about the budget, it would be a lot less complicated. There would be a lot fewer documents and numbers and things that make absolutely no sense to anybody else. And it would be set out in a way that actually made sense to people. So there may well be some extremely, strong value in having more of the public involved, just so actually that the budget process and the end budget documents didn't need, expensively suited economists like me to turn up and tell you how and what and when is happening. It would actually make sense to a lot more people.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe as a last short comment, if you were Grant Robertson, if you could change one thing or include one item into the budget, what would that be? Bernard, maybe first, or Craig. Oh,
No,
you can fire off straight
I'm
up.
delighted for Bernard to go first.
Thanks, Craig. I am luckily unemployable and unelectable, so I can say anything really. I would like to see Grant Robertson propose a 30-year, $200 billion infrastructure and well-being investment plan funded by a broad-based low rate, and when I say low rate, very low rate, 0.03% type rate, 0.3% rate land tax to both pull it back, as in pull back some of the unearned tax-free capital gains that have been made by landowners over the last 30 years, and then pay it forward into the essential housing and climate infrastructure that we need, and also to improve the well-being of the people who are struggling with not enough cash for their daily needs at the moment, and in particular in that infrastructure investment, and both a social and educational and health infrastructure investment, as well as a physical infrastructure investment, that we make clear that particularly the climate transition happen in a just way through measures like free public transport, cash for clunkers, swaps, subsidised electric bikes and cars, those sorts of things, and massive investment in infrastructure for housing. Thank you.
Right, thanks. Craig, over to you.
Sure. I see someone in the chat, but now is not the time for electioneering, so I'll try and give something which is as politically neutral as is possible to be, but also happens to be my answer, which is I would really like a public budget office, an organisation which independently costs and which helps political parties work out what the real costs of their policies are, what the real benefits of their policies are, and which then provides that information to the public. So you can have a real and informed conversation about who benefits where and why from what's being put on the table by political parties at the election. It also looks at the government's books and says, how real are the forecasts that are there, and how realistic is it that the scenarios that have been put out will actually be delivered. And finally, one of the things it does is it identifies the other side of the debt. We spend a lot of time talking about debt. We don't talk about not spending money, the social liability that exists when we choose not to make investments, and how much of that social liability we're taking into the future, and how much we're expecting future generations to pay for roads, rail, housing, schools, when we're not choosing to do that now because we're choosing to take a tax cut, or we're choosing to spend it somewhere else. And so a parliamentary budget office, which is common around the rest of the world, would really help us do that in New Zealand, and would really provide a lot more information. If I can be indulgent for 1 second, I'd also say that I'd really want to see the Minister of Finance and the Prime Minister stand up and say that they're going to make the investments necessary so that we tackle the material well-being, the material poverty, child poverty indicator. Too many of our children live in material poverty. That means they don't have a coat, they don't have 2 pairs of shoes, they don't get 2 hot meals a day. It means they often forego events. Families don't have enough money to keep the heating on yet. They don't go to the doctor or the dentist. That's a sin in New Zealand and needs changing. And so if we could do anything, let's tackle that. And I want to see a programme to tackle that in New Zealand as being the most important thing we could do at budget today.
Thank you so much, Craig and Bernard, for sharing all your wisdom, knowledge, and ideas. I think everybody has really appreciated from what I can see on the chat and also the questions. So thank you again for making yourselves available to talk to our members and also non-members. Of course, if you like to join the PSA, you're most welcome to do so. And of course, our upcoming webinars. So tomorrow we'll have Max Rashbrook to talk about equality and climate. Come along again, join us at the same time. And thank you all participants for coming along and joining us. Without you, it would have been half the fun. Thank you also for everyone who helped with the making this happen in the background there, EJ and Kirsten and the rest of the team. So thank you so much. As you know, this session was recorded, so please do share it with your family and whānau, with your colleagues, of course, and keep on the conversation. Keep on talking. I think that's really important, just prior and also, of course, after the budget will be delivered next week on Thursday. So I'll close us off with a whakatauki and see you all tomorrow. Nā ku te roro, nau te roro, ka ora ai te iwi. With your basket and my basket, we will sustain everyone. So thank you, everyone, and stay well.